talk a little bit more about the rest and recovery, and in particular answer the question, can I use heart rate to tell if I'm overtraining or not? And we already talked about this stress plus rest equals progress and about plateaus, training plateaus, but so far this was quite theoretical. I mean, I do a hard session and I sit down and open a beer at home, go for a next session in a day or two, right? Not to mention that beer and alcohol causes additional stress on the body and slows down recovery. It's again topic for a different webinar. We can use heart rate to guide our recovery and in particular spot different patterns. And in particular, recovery is actually a measure of athlete's condition, and at the same time how it can be quite vague. Kind of how we feel does not necessarily reflect what is actually happening in the body, and at the same time it's a critical period when our body grows stronger and adapts to a higher workload. So without rest, we wouldn't be able to see any improvement in our training, and we already saw that from the graph of accumulated fatigue. If we wouldn't have effective recovery, then we basically stay in that zone where we're always a little bit tired. And I guess some of you might have noticed that also without the training, that accumulated fatigue can happen not only as a physical fatigue, it can also be a mental fatigue. And answer to that is the same as with training. We need a proper rest. During times of stress, our body releases hormones, cortisol, adrenaline, and those need to be utilized. At the same time, our body goes through the glycogen stores, vitamin, minerals, water supplies, everything actually, and that stress drains our body and strips us up from all of those nutrients. And there are different parts of recovery. So again, as I mentioned, it's not just coming home and sitting down. There are actually 4 different categories, kind of factors that contribute to recovery. One is the energy recovery, and ironically, that is the quickest part. So if we're doing a hard interval, the energy is replenished basically within a few minutes. If we go for a longer run, then glycogen that we use, it is replenished maybe within a few hours or within a day or so. That's the carbohydrate recovery. When we go into slightly deeper, the nervous system recovery actually takes multiple days, and the protein synthesis, when we heal those micro traumas and actually grow additional muscle, that takes up to a week or even 10 days. So while at the beginning we might feel that, I did a session, I can go for another session tomorrow, that means I recovered, that is not entirely correct. Our energy might have recovered. We might have recovered our glycogen stores, but our psyche can be still strained from, let's say, a week or 2 of hard training that we did, or we had a intense project at work, and kind of that drains all of our reserves. So this is something where we need to put things together into one single whole. And there are ways how we can actually measure that recovery, ranging from intangible things like, for example, muscle soreness, whether we have it or not, to actually more precise measures. And for example, blood pressure. If we have a high blood pressure, there's a high chance we are stressed, or our body is stressed from a previous exercise. Blood glucose is something that is starting to get traction, and you might notice that there is a new trend, like elite athletes, they use this, they have this circled sticker on their arms, and that is a blood glucose monitor. So they monitor how their daily blood glucose changes, and kind of the response to carbohydrates that we consume, and actually fasting levels of blood glucose would show if we are under stress or not. So that can also be a factor. And actually, for example, people who are having problems with blood glucose, or in kind of struggling with diabetes, maybe even, there is a high correlation between their level of stress and maybe even lack of sleep, or poor diet, that is causing that stress on body, and their level of blood glucose, and that kind of reaction of that glucose. Then sleep quality. There are many different trackers now to track sleep quality, and what is more relevant for our particular webinar today is the resting heart rate and HRV, which is heart rate variability. And if we talk about the resting heart rate, it's a heart rate measurement that you typically take first thing in the morning. And that is your heart rate, which is at rest. And if we know that, we can consider the training stress, monitor our recovery, and basically time the training session for the best results. And during the times of higher stress, be it physical, psychological, or environmental, like heat, humidity, and things like that, our resting heart rate would be elevated, because our body kind of working in the background. Think of it as kind of if there are some updates are installing on the laptop or on the phone, that device would typically be slower. And the same happens here. If the body is still processing, I don't know, cortisol or adrenaline, or repairs the damage, or normalizes the nervous system response, or even processing food that we have just eaten, all of that would impact the resting heart rate, and that is a signal that something is kind of happening in the body, and it is not maybe in the most optimal state for a training. And again, if we go back to which one? Oh, we go all the way back. If we go back to this stress plus rest equals progress chart, then what we see that effect of our training session on already stressed body would be much higher than we have initially expected. And if we stack these sessions together in a training block, then would basically start getting into that, again, accumulated fatigue state, and we wouldn't get to that super compensation effect, and we wouldn't jump over where we would want to. And we can track that with the resting heart rate. And typically we need to know what is our resting heart rate, and then we can track the resting heart rate on a daily basis, and roughly 5 to 7 beats, or 10%, whichever is the higher, change up, 5 to 7 beats per minute, or 10% over the average. That would mean that our body is under recovered, or in other way stressed. And to note here is that our heart is increasing in response to training. But there are two ways how a heart can increase. It can increase in volume, and it can increase in thickness. And when the heart increases in volume, it kind of stretches out thanks to the increase of the volume of the left ventricle of the uh, of of the heart. And if you recall, then the left ventricle is the one that pushes the blood out of the heart. So that means we increase the stroke volume, and that's kind of a natural adaptation, for example, to endurance or any other type of training. And there is a increase in the heart thanks to the effect of the wall thickness. So when the wall of the heart thickens, then the heart is able to kind of contract harder or contract more frequently. And for athletes, for example, there is even a term called athletic heart syndrome, because their resting heart rates are often under 60s or even under 50s. And whereas for a regular person, the resting heart rate is somewhere between 60 and 90. And typically with age, that resting heart rate is decreasing compared to a resting heart rate of, let's say, a 20-year-old, because kind of there is generally less stress on the body, and or rather less demand for the heart to really pump out the blood. And to note here is that this athletic heart syndrome, it's an adaptation of I'm forgetting the word, sorry, it's third hour. But basically, it's a natural adaptation, and when for a regular person, the condition would be called bradycardia, I think. That is too low of a heart rate, meaning that not enough blood is supplied to the working muscles. For an athlete, this is not a problem, because their heart and the cardiovascular system is efficient. So for them, actually, for those who have a resting heart rate of, let's say, under 50, they are better off actually using a slightly different way to track recovery. But to finish off with the resting heart rate, if, for example, a resting heart on a given day is higher than 10%, then it's better to take a day easy or do a very light session, because it signifies that the body is processing stress. And at the same time, it's a good way to track recovery after illness, because very often after we get sick, it takes quite a lot of time for the body to normalize all of the responses. And for example, for every percentage, for every 1 degree increase in temperature, the resting heart rate typically jumps by 10 or 15 beats. So even if our resting heart rate is back to no, even if we, for example, don't experience fever, our resting heart rate can still be elevated. And in this particular case, this is my resting heart rate. And back in December, I had a case of tonsillitis, and as you see, kind of it was always around 44, 45, and then it jumps to close to 60. Then, as I recovered from tonsillitis, I got COVID, and that was basically when I was kind of stuck at home recovering. And only at the end of January, I started recovering, and then. Now I was training for a 10K, and as a long-term adaptation, your resting heart rate is decreasing. So it went from, let's say, 46 or 47 when I started to roughly, I guess, 42 before the race. And as I kind of slowed down, then in the last few days it was a little bit higher from all of the traveling and all of the additional stress that I had throughout the month. But there is a slightly different one, and this is one of the last slides, I promise. This is slightly more advanced way to track your recovery, and it's called heart rate variability, or HRV in short. It's basically a measure of our nervous system, and considered as one of the best measures of stress and determining how your body is ready to perform. So kind of the science behind it is that our nervous system is split into sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. Parasympathetic is the one that is responsible for recovery. So it's called rest and digest, and it handles all of the inputs from internal organs like digestions, growth, and things like that. And it requires the heart rate to beat slower, so it causes a relaxation. The sympathetic nervous system doesn't have any sympathy, and it's kind of this fight or flight mode. It prepares us for the stress factors and the exercise, and it increases our heart rate. And so these two systems, they are working hand in hand, and one is always trying to pull to pull the blanket on their side. And when we get into a period of stress, or for example mental stress, or we're just kind of physically drained from all of the training, that heart rate variability drops, because kind of there is nothing to, or there is little to react towards, and basically our body or our heart starts to beat at exact intervals. So for example, once a second, it would be toof, 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 toof. Whereas if we would have a high heart rate variability, that heart rate would beat and pump blood only kind of in response to that change in those nervous systems, and that would kind of be more chaotic. So it would be like toof, 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 something like this. There are a few studies that were made, and they found a correlation between that effect and the level of cortisol and in general the level of performance. And when that system is balanced again, then this heart rate variability is higher, and when that when we're more in the sympathetic state, be it from stressful day at work or day of traveling, or I don't know, kids are not sleeping, or anything else, then that heart rate variability would be slow, because the body expects more stress and delivers oxygen and nutrients with the blood at the exact interval. So that is kind of the science behind it. And the way to use it is, it's important to know that this heart rate variability is quite sensitive. It considers all factors that contribute to our stress level, and as a result, if we look on it on a daily basis, it can kind of jump up and down and wouldn't provide much information, which is why kind of how I use it, or use it when I train hard for races. I use it on a trend basis. So I look at a weekly trend, and I look at monthly trend. So whenever I see that my daily measurement is much lower than, let's say, a 7-day average, so my last week's average, it's a signal for me that I'm too stressed. And if I go out, for example, and do a hard session, I wouldn't be able to bring myself to the level of intensity that I need to execute that session well. And at the same time, the quality of that session wouldn't be good, which means I wouldn't be able to process much training load, and that wouldn't trigger enough benefit to really move my fitness further. And at the same time, if my 7-day trend is visibly lower than the monthly trend, then it's a signal that the body is accumulating too much stress. Again, it can be from work, it can be from training, it can be from your baby not sleeping during the night. It doesn't matter. Because when we talk about performance, when we talk about training, we are looking at all stress factors combined. And only when we look at all of the stress factors combined, we can really control the training process. And obviously, there will never be a time when everything is united. Even when children are grown up and sleep properly, there probably will be a, I don't know, stressful project at work, or there will be, I don't know, heat wave and very humid weather. Everything will always come up, which is why it's important to look at the trajectory and kind of not necessarily play the hands that you are dealt, but rather select the most optimal day from whatever you have. So that means do a harder session when you feel particularly recovered, for example, or do a kind of more intense or longer session when the heart rate variability is higher. And actually, kind of, I think Garmin and Polar and other watches, they even have like a performance condition or body battery or something like this. They use this heart rate variability data to predict kind of your readiness to perform. And that gets me to the last slide of the presentation. Well, second to last, about how we actually can use that heart rate monitor. So first, what we need to there are different effects that the heart rate monitors are tracking. There is this recovery time, performance condition, training effect, threshold heart rate. That is what Garmin would give you. Probably Polar or Fitbit would have a different naming, but essentially the same thing. And a lot of this confusion about heart rate training comes from those photos you see on Facebook or Instagram, where a person would go for a 30-minute run or 40-minute run, and then Garmin would tell him, oh, kind of recovery time 3 days or something like this. And it comes from basically the concept of zones. How these technology and watches work is that they take your zones and they look at how much time you spend in those zones or compared to your threshold level, and based on that they determine how hard the training was on your body. So kind of they try to use data to kind of to analyze your training. They're not yet there that they are able to figure it out for you without you knowing it, if you train just several days per week, because they cannot predict that. But if you use it consistently and you align the data there, they are actually quite precise. So in my case, for example, all of the kind of performance condition and recovery time, they're more or less spot on. Kind of in telling me how much time I need to recover. So in order to use the heart rate monitor well, you first need to establish your zones and change those in the app, so that your watch actually uses correct zones and takes the relevant training and compares it to your value. And then give it maybe 1 or 2 weeks to adjust and learn about your body. And from there, basically all of this recovery time, performance condition, it would start estimating it well. For example, when I train for a race, and sometimes I don't feel that well, or I feel better than my body actually is. And then I start running, and in the first, I don't know, 10 minutes, the watch tells me that my performance condition is, let's say, -2. And how it does it is throughout all of the time that I've trained with the watch in the last few weeks, it estimated a certain, let's say, VO2 max or certain performance level that it thinks my body is capable of. Obviously, it will not be precise because there's no way for the watch to measure my VO2 max, but it estimates it based on, as mentioned again, this heart rate variability, the pace, and everything. And when I start running, it looks how heart rate changes, what's the variability, what's my current pace, how it compares to my zone, and based on that, it tells me kind of what is my sort of performance condition. And very often, it would kind of usually it's very precise in telling me, for example, my performance condition is extra good today and I actually feel extra fresh. And in some case, it would say your performance condition is, I don't know, -2. And I know that yesterday I had a hard session. So sometimes it helped me actually to slow down and then listen to my body when I was not listening to it based on, you know, my internal feel or effort or something like this. So yeah, that's how you can use the technology to basically guide yourself, guide your training forward. But at the end of the day, it's still only technology. So by the end of the day, it's important how we feel during our training and what kind of what is happening in our body. And